official and government estimates as caution. We had a really good conversation at the recent World Cashew Conference with some of the regulators, and I would say that they are probably a little bit overly optimistic on the outlook for their crop in 2026. So treat these official estimates with caution. If we look at the Cambodian situation and pose the question, is Cambodia really producing more than 1 million tons? Well, the answer is it certainly did last year and is likely to again this year. The CAC, one of the associations in Cambodia, estimated the crop as 21% higher in 2025 than in 2024. But if we look at some of the stats, exports to Vietnam, 970,000 tons. That's based on mirror data from Vietnam, which we believe to be accurate. Growth is slowing, as you can see from the chart. We saw very fast growth, couple of poor crops, and then growth again. But growth is not stopping. Growth is just slowing, and it could not be maintained at the rates of 2019, 2020, 2021. That would never ever going to happen. So is it 1 million tons? Well, 2026, no real extreme weather. It has been cooler. There have been showers, but there's no reason to believe any major hazard for the crop. I think Cambodia will produce more than 1 million tons in 2026, repeating and probably increasing the performance of 2025. Early traded prices, well, as often happens, the early prices are pretty high. In dollars, $13.50 to $14.00. That's high price raw material. The market's quiet at the moment. Of course, Vietnam is in the midst of the Tet holidays, but before and after. I would expect these prices to moderate a little bit. But again, we're talking about pretty high quality raw cashew nuts, 48 to 51 pounds, very large nuts, very suitable for markets like China, maybe not giving as many 320s as buyers in Western countries might be used to. But if we look at this and step back and just take the big picture, I would say based on what's already planted, we could expect a crop of about 1.3 million tons by 2030. That could be bigger. It's unlikely to be smaller. The direction is certainly upward for production in Cambodia. Our next questions are on the demand side. We look at EU demand, the US market, and China. So let's start with the European Union. And looking at the official import data, January through to November, we see that imports in 2025 were up by 7.5%. This is the European Union, 27 countries, plus the UK combined. So it's just the UK imports from outside the European area. So overall, we're seeing a very positive year. If we look at the previous years, so if we compare to 2024, you can see the gap throughout the year has been positive. Each year was higher than the equivalent year in 2024, and even more so than 2023. So we are definitely seeing a positive growth in the European Union market. We did see a quiet end to 2025. Some people have said to me that perhaps they didn't see offtake as they'd hoped for or as they might have expected. We're now into February. Today's the 18th of February. Buyers still have some time. They would be covered for the nearby positions. They're not going to take that risk, but they still have some time to wait and see. And I think what they're doing is they're waiting to see how the crop, particularly in West Africa, starts to come in. And they would have been encouraged by the early noises, though they may have been confused by some of the stuff we've seen online, as I say, trader talk. Big numbers are floating around for the crop. I mentioned the official figures, 6.7 million. There is one importer touting that figure around for some reason. Definitely positive. Definitely buyers taking their time. They see no reason to rush. Definitely a little bit more disappointing end to the year than expected, but overall we see strong growth. Now, if we look at the longer term picture, if we take 5 year growth on imports, in the 5 years up to 2025, the annual average growth was 4.5%, which is positive. But if we look at 2024, which was over 11%, and 2025 for 11 months up to November, 7.5%, it does seem that imports to the European Union are gathering some momentum. And this has been in a period of a certain amount of economic uncertainty, high energy costs, high prices. We saw what that could do in the second half of 2022, but since then, the news, generally speaking, has been positive. Within those trends, a couple of things: the great growth for imports from West Africa, 21% share of the market, mainly for Cote d'Ivoire in the first 11 months of 2025. That's going to continue. I don't think it'll grow as quickly as it has been growing. It generally happens that the buyers who want to switch early, and then the rate of growth slows down. So there still is a lot of work to do in bringing cashew kernels from African countries to the European market, but the signs are quite positive. Let's have a look then at the US market. So this has been the big question, and as I say, 2025 has broken records, but they're not good records. You can see in this chart, so this is the monthly imports. The black bars are 2025, and the lines are the equivalent cumulative totals for each of the previous 3 years. And you can see that 2025 is way behind any of the other years. In fact, the actual import figures to the end of November were down by 32%. This is just on the natural cashew kernels. Processed cashew kernels, where imports were quite steady. They were actually up in the course of the year. Natural cashew kernels, so far up to November, around about 120,000 tons of imports. Processed, around about 45,000 tons. So it is significant, but here we're looking just at the natural cashew kernels. And I think we're talking here about the impact of tariffs. Tariffs were introduced in April, although the conversation started long before that. The tariffs, it was more complexity than simply just an increase in price. Certainly there was an increase in price due to import tariffs, and that was to a certain extent passed on eventually to the consumer. But there are other aspects to that. Importers, mainly having sold on a delivered basis, so that would be DDP, as we call it in Incoterms, delivered duty paid, they would have had to go to their customers and discuss, one, who's going to pay this import duty, and two, how's it going to affect demand. So some buyers will have said, you're paying the import duty and we want you to deliver these goods later because we think demand will suffer. Clearly that was a shock for importers. For the most part, negotiations followed. But I did notice recently also that imports have another impact, and that is that importers must put up bonds. There are $3.6 billion of outstanding bonds in the United States. So tariffs are complex in their impact. It's not just that they increase prices, they increase the way business is done, they put contracts at risk, and they cause, at every stage in the chain, they cause problems of renegotiation, problems of just exactly what does this contract mean. Is the introduction of tariffs a force majeure, for example? It's certainly not an act of God. So the US market, with higher food prices, economic uncertainty, really reacted negatively during 2025. I think in the coming year, with the tariffs now gone since November, buyers will follow the prices. If they see good value, they will buy. but I think they will see no reason to rush into the market. I think also there's a bigger question, and that is whether or not buyers' confidence is damaged, whether or not they perhaps see that the long-held belief that cashews could only go one way, and that was up in terms of consumption, is now significantly damaged. The US is a major producer of tree nuts. It's a major exporter of tree nuts. All of the tree nut sectors have been affected by tariffs, either for import or for export. If those tree nuts are not going for export, they may be going to the domestic market. Now, maybe it's not quite as bad as it looks taking 2025 in isolation. So let's have a look, a step back, and look at this from a longer term perspective. So what we've seen is, taking from 2016, a generally positive trend in imports. We saw at the end of 2022 a fall off in demand, but an increase in imports, and that was reflected in 2023. Then in 2024, we saw a certain amount of growth. I think it was about 7% growth in supermarket sales, but there was a greater growth in imports, over 20%, and that growth in imports was in anticipation of the introduction of tariffs, I think. So what we see is something of a balancing. So if we take 2024 and 2025 average imports, we get a figure of 152,000 tons average over the 2 years. And if we compare that to the period 2020 to 2023, an average of 163,000 tons, that would mean a drop of just about 8%. So it's not as critical or as final as it may look if we just take 2025 in isolation. But I would pose the question, is the growth trend in the US market broken? Are we likely to see the market stagnate? Are we likely to see the market stop growing? Now, we were seeing a change in consumer behavior with regard to cashews in the US. We had been seeing more younger consumers. We had been seeing cashews being used for other uses apart from the typical snack food use with which we're also familiar. Is that the area that's going to lose growth, or will it be in the snack food segment? And that remains to be seen. So in the newer uses and the newer applications, there's more of an opportunity to sell brokens. In the snack food uses, there's more of an opportunity to sell the typical 320s and other whole grades that we're used to. I think we probably should recognize, and this is particularly pertinent for Cambodia, that the opportunity to sell premium nuts, the larger ones, is diminished in the United States, at least for now. So trouble in the US, I don't think we should look there for too much growth in 2026. I think it will grow. I think it will recover to a certain extent, but perhaps not as much as we might have hoped for. So higher imports when demand is under pressure, higher imports based on good demand ahead of tariffs, and then a crash down in imports last year. That is a difficult story in the US, and we will need to follow that closely. Much more positive story, although equally difficult, is China. We have seen remarkable growth in the imports of cashew kernels into China in recent years. Last year was a standout year, 183,766 tons. So that's taking all origins together. It is actually tricky enough to work out what the exact number is, but I've tried to take the different parts and compile that number. I think it's there or thereabouts. You can see how much of an increase that is from last year, but you can also see that this has been part of a steady growth trend over a longer period. So if we go back to 2016, imports were 48,000 tons. So even without last year, growth was pretty significant, and we were likely to see continued and interesting growth in the US market, in the Chinese market, excuse me. It's dominated, of course, by Vietnam, as you would expect, given the location. We did see last year more imports from African countries, and not any significant volume, but the beginnings perhaps of something. I would expect the Chinese imports to continue to grow. In 2025, imports up 34%. The 5-year growth rate is 16%. This is really significant. That would make China the fastest growing market in the world. Imports were up by 47,000 tons. So far, so good. This all looks really very positive. But if we look at the imports of other tree nuts, almonds and pistachios, which were primarily from the United States, we see a drop in those imports of 107,000 tons. So that means that tree nut imports of almonds and pistachio are down about double the increase of cashew kernels. So cashews has benefited, no doubt, from the increase in imports and the increase in tariffs from the United States, and perhaps in China, a preference for non-US tree nuts for the time being. But if that tariff situation were to change, if the trade relationships were to moderate, that could be easily threatened. I think we're going to see imports continue to grow. We had some interesting conversations with some Chinese representatives. I think imports will grow, but not at the pace of last year. There will be continued demand for Burma kernels. There'll be continued demand for large kernels, either from Vietnam or increasingly from China. And most interestingly, that the 7% import duty on African countries is to end. It doesn't mean, given the location, that there's particularly big price advantage, but it will mean, at least from a tariff point of view, that African cashew kernels are on a level playing field with Vietnamese or Cambodian. So continued growth in China. Essentially last year, what we saw was that the growth in China completely offset and exceeded the loss of imports into the US market. If we got a year where the US market was static and China's growth was slower, it would mean that the overall demand growth would fall significantly. So our next question is about foreign exchange, and we're getting into questions on how foreign exchange rates and the volatility in those rates have changed pricing for different markets. So first of all, this is a comparison between euro prices and dollar prices. The euro is a really important currency in terms of cashews. Obviously, the euro area in Europe covers the major importers, countries like Germany, the Netherlands, France, Italy, Spain are all major importers. They all use the euro. If we look at how the change in the foreign exchange rate, the weakness of the dollar to the euro has changed prices. So if we take prices, and here's our WW320s, FOB, US dollars versus the euro from January 2021 until this month. And what you can see is the red is the dollar price per pound FOB, and the blue is the euro price. The dotted line is the exchange rate, and that's charted on the axis on the right-hand side. So what you see is, as the US dollar gets weaker against the euro, the price for European buyers becomes more attractive. If we look at just 2 points, so if we take the market low of 2024, which was in April of 2024, the price in US dollars, FOB, has risen by 32% since then. It's been up and down within the range, but right now it's about 32% higher than it was at that moment. But for European buyers, buying in euros, that's only 20%. So this puts European buyers at a certain amount of advantage. Now there's a second aspect to the euro, and that is that the CFA, the West African franc, is linked to the euro. So if we look at our small graph on the top left, we can see a chart of the US dollar to the CFA over the same period. And we can see, again, because it's linked to the euro, that there is significant strength over the past 2 years. What does that mean? Well, it means that just taking the farm gate price. So I took the farm gate price simply because it's a constant. Right? And as you can see in CFA, the farm gate price has gone 315, 275, up to 425 last year, and down to 400 this year. If we convert that to dollars over the period, we see that the price in the CFA local currency in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire in this case, that price is up by 45%. But if we take it in US dollars, that price is up by 58%. So this strength has significant influence. This, of course, means that trade from Cote d'Ivoire or any other currency, any other country using the CFA to Euro countries is more attractive and makes much more sense because you eliminate the impact of this volatility. But it also means that for dollar buyers and Indian buyers, Vietnamese buyers of RCN are all dollar buyers, as well as the buyers in the United States for cashew kernels, we're seeing increased prices. So the currency in this case is multiplying the impact of price rises. In Europe, it's reducing the impact of price rises, but at the farm gate and therefore FOB for RCN, it's multiplying it. Similarly, if we look at the Indian situation, so the Indian rupee, we're looking at a different relationship. The Indian rupee is much weaker against the US dollar over the period than the euro. And what we see here is, again, the same chart. And if we convert in this chart, so on the left-hand side is the price just basically converted to Indian rupees. And on the right-hand side are the prices in US dollars. And what we see is that the relationship between the two has moved out. In other words, that when raw cashew nuts are bought by Indian buyers and converted into Indian rupees today, the growth since April 2024 has been 56%. That is really huge. But the price in US dollars is only up by 41%. Now, also, I think it's important to notice that earlier we spoke about the kernel's price and the price increase. And relatively speaking, RCN is more expensive now. So this is one of the reasons why, more than likely, processors in India and to a certain extent processors in Vietnam are suffering tighter margins over the last couple of years. Now, it should be said that in Vietnam, if you import in US dollars and you export in US dollars, the currency impact is very limited. In India, because essentially I think it's 92% of cashews processed in India are consumed in India, and 60% of those are imported, it means that the impact is much greater. It hasn't actually impacted consumption in India so far. What it's done is it's really squeezed profit margins. So if we look at that period and we see this widening gap from the two prices tracking each other to this breakout, it means a couple of things. It means that you could well see it more interesting for Indian processors to re-enter the export market. But you could also see higher prices for cashews in India. And what that means is more difficult to work out. So let's have a look at what's been happening in India. Indian consumption continued to grow in 2025. The forex weakness happened toward the end of the year, but generally speaking, when we look at the growth rate of consumption in India, calculated, and it is always calculated in India because we don't have statistics, but we do know roughly how much grows, we know how much is imported, and we have a lot of real experts in India that we can talk to about the market. My calculation is that the 5-year growth rate on Indian consumption is about 6.6%. This is very fast. It's as fast as it's been for many years. We're going back, you've got to go back about 20 years to find such growth rates. In contrast, the 10-year growth is at about 4%. So we are seeing accelerated growth in Indian demand for cashew kernels. We've seen the high imports in 2025, and that maybe is something of a concern because it could well be that the inventories are quite high coming out of the year. I do think we will see demand continue to grow if the 6% growth continues, and India is now a 400,000 ton kernels market. I mean, if we think about that, 400,000 tons, you're getting on in the region of 2 million tons of raw cashew nuts. So when you're seeing a 6% growth, you're seeing over 100,000 tons a year extra raw cashew nuts needed. Every 5 years, that means that you're going to be looking for another Tanzania. It seems remarkable. But what's more remarkable, as we will see, is how fast the production is growing. So we now also see other news in India. We see a trade agreement with the United States, which may mean, it's not clear to me, maybe it's clear to others who can inform us, no tariffs on the import of tree nuts. Indian consumers like almonds, mainly from the United States. They like pistachio nuts, which come from the United States and from Iran. The trade agreement with the US may mean no tariffs, and that could have an impact on cashew kernel demand in India. The Indian rupee, well, could it strengthen? It did strengthen a little bit after the trade deal was announced, but at least on what I see, there's no major recovery expected by analysts. So whereas they're not saying that the rupee will continue to weaken, they're saying that it is not likely to strengthen either. So generally speaking, there is a realization in India of the importance of cashews, and I think it's for the first time we saw cashews mentioned in the union budget. This is a huge move forward. There will be support for production growth. Indian production has been growing very slowly, and it is likely to make a significant difference, if not, given the amount of money involved is not enormous, but it is likely to make a difference in terms of the overall profile of the sector. If we look at India's production, so you can see on this chart, we have a bar chart showing in orange imports of raw cashew nuts in tons, and the gray bars are the production of raw cashew nuts. So you can certainly see that a couple of things jumping out. First of all, that the growth in production is very slow. If we consider that the growth in production is less than 2% per annum, and the current growth rate of consumption is certainly more than 6%, probably more than 6.5%, India is due to continue to grow. I think what the government of India is concerned about and seeking to address is these grey bars, this trend in production. So even for last year, the estimates vary. I've used 800,000 tons in this because that's an official figure I got, but others will tell you that was 100,000 tons less. Other thing that jumps out from this chart is these are big import numbers similar to 2022. In 2022, there was a big carryout into the following year. Are we going to see the same thing? Interestingly, spot trade toward the end of the year suggested that there was some kind of form of tightness in the market in India. I'm not sure about that. There was some exports or re-export to Vietnam, but I don't think that was more than 75,000 tons. So I think we can continue to see growth in India in 2026, but it's going to be some time before the initiatives to increase production take hold. Next question. Informal trade. Can regulators cope? And this is one of the most challenging things. And I've focused Africa is not the only continent on which there is informal trade. There's significant informal trade, for example, on the Cambodia-Vietnam border, but it is the place where it has the greatest influence. And if we look at this issue, it is problematic. I think if you've joined us before, you've seen some of these charts which show the red arrows show informal trade and the black arrows show the natural flow of trade, which is legal. But there is significant informal trade. And what does it mean? Well, it means obviously a revenue loss for governments. Informal trade tends to take place across borders where there are tariffs due. It means that prices are distorted. It means that the market becomes more volatile. None of these are positive for the future of the sector. It also means that traceability, already a huge challenge in the international trade in raw cashew nuts. It is virtually impossible to ensure traceability in the RCN chain. It means that we're also looking at a situation where there's loss of traceability. And you will have seen, there are now origins called Benin Togo and various versions of that, and we know what that means. There are endless shipments from Côte d'Ivoire, despite the efforts of governments on both sides of the border to control the trade. There are many, many shipments. There also have been in the past smuggling from Côte d'Ivoire into Guinea. There have been a lot of cross-border trade illegally between Guinea-Bissau and Senegal. All of these things are having an impact. None of that impact is positive. And worst of all, what it's doing is there's a certain element in our industry that has become criminalized. These are local traders, smugglers, and that is not healthy because, in essence, farmers are part of that chain. I think that it will again be a challenge. I think the answer to this would be policy harmonization across West Africa, but I think that is a long way away. If we could, for example, harmonize export taxation, it would take some of the sting out of the smuggling and the informal trade, and it would allow, to a certain extent, product to flow to its more logical and lower cost export point. Longer run, this will become irrelevant if Africa processes all of the cashew nuts it grows. But that too is a long way away. Moving on, but staying around this policy regulatory issues. And I just unfortunately think that the policy and regulation changes have actually contributed to market volatility. It became more fashionable, particularly in West Africa, to regulate the industry around about 2018. And since then, there have been some great initiatives. There have been some massive failures. But generally speaking, it's the tinkering, the changing at short notice, the mid-April deciding we're going to export, we're not going to export, or we are going to export, or we're not going to drop the tax, or we're going to increase the tax. These kind of things have contributed to market volatility. What are we seeing this year so far? Well, we're seeing lower farm gate prices, minimum prices in Côte d'Ivoire, as I mentioned earlier, down to 400 CFA, a modest decrease given the market, but nonetheless a decrease. More significant decrease in Ghana, I think down from 16 to 12 cedis. We're seeing the processor windows retained. So this is the periods during which only processors can buy raw cashew nuts from farmers. In some countries, I think this may be a little bit longer. Côte d'Ivoire has introduced their processor window is from the 9th of February, so it's already started, until the 15th of March. I wouldn't be surprised if in Burkina Faso we saw a temporary ban. And judging on some of the announcements during the Ghanaian cashew conference yesterday, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some changes in Ghana too over time. I don't think that the mentioned export ban will happen, but I do think there will be some regulatory changes. Fortunately, I think in Nigeria, and it's a good decision or non-decision, if you want to put it that way, Nigeria seems to have ditched the idea of an RCN export ban. I don't think that was ever likely to happen, but it was a bit frightening, particularly if you're a farmer, if you understood what that might have meant for farmers. Benin is going to keep the export ban. That means more smuggling. It means more struggles in Benin. It is, they're going to stick with it for the long term and hope that it increases their processing. And let's hope they're right. But so far, the indications are not particularly good. Senegal has introduced an export tax at the end of last season. And in Ghana, of course, the levy, which is a small levy, I think it's less than $10 a ton, has been introduced. That may well be a sign of things to come in Ghana, increasing export taxation on raw cashew nuts. The talk in Ghana, as I mentioned, of a ban on RCN, I just don't see how they could introduce that or why they would introduce that. Ghana is also a huge transit point. I think it was 460,000 tons of raw cashew nuts was either grown or traveled through Ghana last year. Banning the export of RCN just wouldn't make sense in that context, particularly when the processed volumes in the country are so small. But Ghana has big ambitions. It has ambitions to process 60% of its crop. It has ambitions to distribute 8 million seedlings. These are excellent initiatives. Let's hope they happen. And I suppose the one policy or regulatory issue that's made headlines, in West Africa at least, has been the reduction in subsidies in Côte d'Ivoire. So these were introduced as a major headline measure back in 2018. They grabbed attention. They improved the level of investment in processing. They have now been reduced. The subsidies were originally introduced with the idea of them being in place for about 5 years. Have they done their job? Yes, they've certainly done their job. Look at the processing capacity increase in the country. They're now reducing those. So there has been a reduction of about 25% for Ivorian-owned businesses, but a major reduction for foreign companies, 62.5% reduction in the subsidy. The subsidy works as an export subsidy on cashew kernels. They will no longer subsidize the export of Burma kernels. So this is part of the drive to retain value addition at home. There's no doubt that the withdrawal of the subsidy will cause a certain amount of hardship for struggling businesses, particularly Ivorian-owned businesses, and I guess that's the logic behind that less reduction for them. For foreign businesses, I think for the most part, despite what they may say publicly, foreign businesses have been expecting this for some time. Not many new businesses, despite being told that the subsidy would continue, not many of them would have written that into their business plan. They probably would have taken the approach, and certainly those that I advised, I would have told them to take this approach. If it comes, it's good news. It will accelerate the journey toward profitability, but don't expect it. And I think many companies have taken that approach, and therefore they won't be altogether surprised, and therefore it won't have a huge impact on those companies. What it may well do is level the playing field somewhat for investment elsewhere, in Ghana, in Nigeria, and other countries, Tanzania perhaps, in cashew processing. So we may see greater competition between countries now to attract investment. What about Tanzania, as I just mentioned it? So can East Africa continue to grow? We've seen fast growth, and you can see in the chart, very fast growth. Here we are back in 2020, only a 210,000 crop, 280,000 tons in 2019. And this year we're probably I think we're probably in the range of 525 to 550. The Cashew Board disagrees with me. They still maintain about 600,000 tons. They're probably right, but we'll see. Earlier, the estimates of 700,000 tons were frustrated by rain in September. I'm not altogether comfortable with the way these estimates have been done. I don't think it was ever likely to be 700,000 tons, as we said way back last October on this event. But we are seeing tremendous progress, improved varieties, better access to inputs, planting over a wider area, and that is critical. The board tells us there are 460 plus thousand farmers in Tanzania and 129 million trees, which sounds a lot, but don't forget the yield on cashew trees remains relatively low. What's very significant is that the Cashew Board is telling us that more than 146,000 additional hectares are planted. This would mean production continuing to rise, and I think it will. Cashew Board forecasts 1 million tons, or targets, perhaps a better or fairer way to put it, 1 million tons by 2030. It's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it is possible. So if we look at this continued growth in Tanzania, our estimate, the crop will reach about 850,000 tons by 2030, but that needs further research. The board says 1 million tons. They may well be right. We'll see. What about the other big producer in East Africa, Mozambique? So early season positive forecasts from IAM were rained on, unfortunately. Trade sources now estimate the crop in or around 130,000 tons, and that's not much different from the previous year. Rains in December, reducing the quantity and to a certain extent the quality too. Most of the crop is already sold. Offers around $1,500, $1,525. When I say sold, I mean the RCN export element. Longer term, watch out in Mozambique. There is funding, there is activity to increase production. There are some talented people organizing it, and I think that we will see an increase in production. But what we've seen so far is relatively slow growth. So we've not seen growth. However, we should remind ourselves that 5 years ago, people were forecasting that Mozambique production would collapse because trees were getting old, it was said. That hasn't happened. It is relatively static, and it has been growing, or it has been at least steady and growing slowly over the last 5 years. So less pessimistic than might have been expected, and reason to believe that growth will return and probably increase in the coming years. I'm going to take all of these things in the Southern Hemisphere, all of these factors, and when we look at the current trend, that would mean in 2025 Southern Hemisphere production. So that means Tanzania and Mozambique in East Africa, Madagascar too. It means Indonesia, Brazil, and a few other smaller producers. That means production in the Southern Hemisphere since 2016, for example, has risen from 630,000 tons to almost 950,000 tons on the 2025 crop. That's fast growth. That's a growth rate of 8% per annum. On that trend, we would be looking at just under 1.4 million tons by 2030. Big increase, likely to continue. We know that in Tanzania, it is possible that this continues because we have seen that it has already happened. We know in Mozambique, it's possible. We know that Indonesia is likely to increase, although slowly. And we know that, surprisingly, but it has happened, that plantings in Brazil have increased a little over the last couple of years. So we won't see another big drop, at least. Now let's try and put some context into this overall. So taking our West African discussion, our India discussion, and our East Africa discussion together, what would it mean if these production trends continued? What would it mean if these production trends continued until 2030? And if we look at it, that would mean that by 2030, production would be 7.3 million tons. This year, our estimate is just over 6. By 2035, that would be 8.6 million tons. That's based on our calculations, which are based on trends with a little bit of adjustment for new plantings and the age of trees. If we took the official figures, it would be 7.6 million tons by 2030. So about 300,000 tons more. But if we were to apply the official forecasts to 2035, you're looking at a crop well over 9 million tons. So it seems to me that the production increase that we're looking at by 2030, just to put it in kind of accessible numbers, it's more than the entire import of the US market in 2025. We're going to produce enough cashews to supply, enough extra cashews to supply the US market twice by 2030. And by 2035, taking growth as it is in the US, EU, and China on consumption side and taking growth in production, by 2035, the increase in production will be more than the total imports of the European Union, the United States, and China put together last year. We are really, based on these trends, and that does, of course, does not take into account seasonal, climatic, weather adjustments year on year. But we are really looking to continue a period of very strong production growth. What does that mean? What could it mean? Well, when we look at production growth, so here's a chart. So the orange bars are consumption of cashews year on year, 2016 to 25. The green bars are production the same period. It's all in raw cashew nut tons. I take an average outturn of 47 pounds and I take an average 4% processing loss. If we take that trend in production and project it, which means just based on what's happened in the last 10 years, if that's a guideline to what will happen in the next 10 years, we get up to our 8.2 million tons of production. These are huge numbers. And we're now, with production being so big, we're now into a different scale of growth because we're dealing with big numbers. If we apply to that the trend of consumption, so if we apply a trend of production versus the trend of consumption, what we see over the next 10 years is that production significantly outperforms consumption. So you can see the current trend of consumption is the blue, and the current trend in production is the orange. When you look at that and just forecast it forward, what you're looking at by 2035 is about a 1 million ton surplus production of raw cashew nuts every year. And that's too much to sustain current prices without a shadow of a doubt. The fact that it continues for 10 years is a little bit misleading. We know that some years there will be a poor crop. Some years there will be a bumper crop. This tracks what might be called an average crop over the period. So what we are entering is a period of fundamental structural production surplus if the current trends continue. And there's an issue here because over many, many years, governments who are now increasingly involved in the cashew sector have shown themselves to be very effective at increasing production. But they rarely, if ever, have done anything to increase consumption, either in their domestic markets or in international markets on which they depend. It starts to become critical. Now, you might say, this is great news for processors and consumers, and that might be true. But if prices were to fall so significantly, particularly in a period of climate change where you might see other food crops struggling, it's likely that production of cashews would, by 2035, start to become less and less interesting for farmers. So the surplus could then turn into an even greater problem, and that's a problem that can kill an industry. And I don't say that lightly. So we are looking at a significant fundamental trend where supply will outstrip consumption unless we do something about it. And that is the elephant in the room. And I would look at a number of factors on this. Countries and their increasing involvement in the cashew sector, they look to promote production to improve incomes or reduce import dependence. It makes sense. On the other hand, production without matching market consumption growth is risky. We've seen this in other products. We've seen it at different times in different products where overproduction led to critical price falls and eventually crisis in the industry. And let's remember that the key members of this chain are the poorest members of this chain. They're smallholder families that do not have the capacity to withstand these kind of price shocks. Lower farm gate prices make smallholders more vulnerable. There is also, as more and more product is produced, a need for more and better post-harvest infrastructure. Already, we struggle to manage the raw cashew nut trade. We struggle to preserve the quality, to maintain the outturn yield, to control the moisture on the current crop. What will that be like if that crop rises to more than 8 million tons? In this context, it's pretty clear, at least to me, that concentrated processing, in other words, 86% of the world's processing in 2 countries, is not the best way to manage this challenge. It's pretty clear that origin-based processing must grow. It's equally clear that that is not going to happen to 100%. So it's unrealistic to think that all the cashews that grow in Africa will be processed in Africa. That's not going to happen simply because the number of cashews that grow in Africa is going to grow more quickly than demand, is going to grow more quickly than we could possibly build and commission factories to manage it. So concentrated processing is not the best management. Building more factories in Vietnam to process more and more African cashews just doesn't really make sense. It did make sense 20 years ago. It has been a spectacular success, but right now it doesn't make sense. We need to look at origin processing. And I think for me, the most important message from this type of analysis, whether you agree with it or not, the general trend is there. Growth, if we want to grow production, we need to also grow consumption, and we need to promote the consumption of cashew nuts. There are several good lessons of how that can be done. The famous case of the Californian almonds, but there are also others. Market growth needs promotion. Will people buy more cashews? They will. But they need to know about them. They need to have different. It's better suited to smaller factories. My feeling is that's changed. India will make it, and possibly India will return to the export of cashew kernels. The general rule, cashew production growth is driven by more trees on more land. And I think for me, if I look at it, I think that the current price range works. It works for farmers, it works for kernels buyers, it works for consumers. Perhaps the international price of raw cashew nuts may be a little bit high, and that's where I would see the potential for something of a correction in the short term. Keep an eye on policy.
Recording in
disrupts the
progress.
market, and particularly keeping an eye on West Africa over the coming 4 to 6 weeks, I would say. So that's it from me today. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you for those questions. Really, really interesting questions. I would love to have more time to talk about them. If you do want to talk cashews, there's my number. You can get me on WhatsApp. There's my email address, contact ACA. Always happy to talk cashews. Next time, we're going to have a look at the crops for 2026, and we're going to have a look at demand as the year progresses. So for now, from me, thanks very much. Thanks to ACA. Thanks to you all, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much to you, Jim Fitzpatrick. Excellent presentation as always. And thanks to our participants also. See you in 2 weeks, and bye-bye to everyone. Bye.
Can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro-color difference, mold, and spores, which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro-color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Meyer is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.